Uh, Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Politics of Aggression, Turkey's Foreign Policy and its Democratic Demise. I'm Merve Tayiroğlu, POMET's Turkey Program Coordinator, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Turkey is pursuing an increasingly assertive and militaristic foreign policy. To its west, it is engaged in a dangerous confrontation with Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean and remains at loggerheads with Cyprus over natural gas resources there. To its east, Turkey is escalating a recently reignited military conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, sending in weapons and fighters to Nagorno-Karabakh. Turkey is in active military combat in Syria, Iraq, and Libya, and has adversarial relations with Egypt, Israel, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And while Turkey remains a NATO ally and pro-EU on paper, it has antagonized its transatlantic allies by weaponizing Syrian refugees against the EU and by buying S-400 missile defense system from Russia. This assertive and, as many would say, aggressive foreign policy is in many ways a product of Turkey's recent democratic demise, including President Erdoğan's consolidation of power over Turkey's foreign policy establishment and other institutions, and his reliance on populist nationalism to shore up power. Today, we'll discuss how this democratic backsliding contributes to Turkey's foreign policy crises and how the international community can respond. Let me briefly introduce our panelists for you. Sinem Adar is an associate at the Center for Applied Turkey Studies, CATS, which is based at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or SWP, in Berlin. Alan Makovsky is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He's a highly prominent Turkey analyst here in Washington, D.C., and I should mention that he is also a CAPS fellow with SWP. And İlke Toygur, who's also a CATS fellow at SWP, is also an analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid. So I will go around and ask 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, and then we'll move on to audience questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen or email your question to communications@pomet.org. I apologize in advance if I'm unable to get to your question, as we will have to wrap up in an hour at noon. So I would like to start our discussion with İlke. İlke, you and Sinem are, like Sinem, are watching Turkish foreign policy unfold from Europe and with a focus on Turkey's relations with the EU. So given that the East Med crisis right now is one of the most important aspects at play here, I wanted to ask, how does Turkey's behavior in the East Med, but also in the broader region, appear from that point of view? Or specifically, what do Turkey's unilateral actions and assertiveness signal about its desired role in the region and its relations with Europe?
Thank you very much, Merve, for first of all, for the invitation and for this interesting and very difficult question, because what I can say in one sentence is Turkey is back on the table in the European agenda. This is very clear. And the regional conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean has converted into a European problem, because these tensions over continental shelves, exclusive economic zones, they were already there. But with the recent discoveries of gas, the issue has become even more visible. But it's not just because of gas either, because it's making basically yourself visible, marking the territory in the region, becoming an important actor. This is what Turkey has been trying to do. And this has one more layer, because it is also very much connected to the bigger picture of great power competition. So I think that we need a very layerly look when we want to understand what is going on. When we come to the European perception, on the other hand, I would say there is no united European perception. My colleagues at European institutions would not like necessarily that response, because solidarity has been the key word when it comes to the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. The official stance clearly is from EU's point of view, that what Turkey has been doing in the Eastern Mediterranean is counter to the EU's interests and violates international law and sovereign rights of member states. This is clearly the official stance. But when it comes to the differences between EU institutions and member states, we have more nuances there. And I strongly think understanding these nuances are crucially important if we want to understand Turkey-EU relations in the bigger sense. The second point I would like to make in this regard is the interdependency between Turkey and the European Union, because when we are talking about the interdependency, be it economy, be it irregular migration, be it fight against terrorism, it is not necessarily at the same degree when it comes to Turkey and all the EU member states. For example, Germany is way more connected to Turkey compared to Spain. So when we are talking about the attitudes of member states, we should definitely take into consideration. And another point, which is going to be my last point, I know you want us to be short and precise, is that Turkey has been accumulating many problems and many irritants with the European Union. I think this is very important to understand when we are talking about this, because this has been a very fragile status quo. On the side, democratic backsliding, rule of law, human rights, etc., etc. On the other side, the foreign policy implications of Syria, Libya, Eastern Mediterranean, now Nagorno-Karabakh. This status quo has been very fragile. So this is why we are perceiving various problems between member states, between Turkey and EU institutions, and we should disentangle this debate further for understanding what is going on there.
Thank you, Ike. That's a really comprehensive answer on the EU side. But I guess broadly speaking, could we be able to say then that the problems in the East Med or the East Med crisis right now is only adding to the sort of negative perception, broadly speaking, in Turkey's neighbors, which is a result of accumulated other
definitely
in the background. Thank you for that. I think it's important to set the tone like that, because we're not just talking about one crisis, of course, but multiple ones. And I want to switch it to Sinem here and really try to talk about some of the causes of these, because Turkey's, what I would call aggression in this region is sort of, as Ike mentioned, is coming at this high cost of really unprecedented regional isolation and a serious questioning among Turkey's Western allies, of course, of its intentions and global orientation. So I wanted to ask you, why is Turkey behaving this way despite this massive cost that it's incurring, and what are specifically the domestic drivers of such an aggressive foreign policy?
Thank you, Merve, and thank you also for the kind invitation. I mean, even though military threats and also military operations have not been absent in the history of the Republic, as we saw in the 1990s with the cross-border operations in Iraq, or with the invasion of Cyprus in 1974, or with the military threat to invade Syria over a border dispute in 1930s, I think it's fair to say that the current moment constitutes an important watershed in terms of that Turkey dares to engage in military conflicts at multiple fronts simultaneously. When we there are certain domestic factors behind this, and I'm going to basically lay them out in terms of actor configurations, perceptions, and capabilities. And I think all of these basically or the first two are consequences of the 2016 coup attempt. Now, the 2016 coup attempt provided an opportunity for different actors, mainly in the far right and far left, with different ideological and political orientations, to go into a kind of like a log-rolling relationship with President Erdoğan. And around like this, basically kind of like this mixture of actors, three main perceptions shape their thinking. First is that this specific actor configuration brought into sharp relief Turkey's traditional threat perception, mainly focusing on 3 points. First is the maritime conflict with Greece, the status of Cyprus, and Kurdish independence in Syria, Iraq, and also Kurdish autonomy in Southeast and Eastern Anatolia. Now, second, the coup attempt intensified, I think, Turkey's existing sense of being alone and not being understood by its traditional partners in the West, which in a way kind of started in 2014, or not necessarily started, but one of the important turning points was when US allied with YPG-PYD in northern Syria in the fight against ISIS. But you can also go back to the 2000s and talk about a series of events, such as, US invasion of Iraq in 2003, Cyprus becoming an EU member in 2004, Sarkozy and Merkel at the end of 2000 basically making announcements about kind of like hesitations about Turkey's EU membership, but offering strategic membership instead. So I think these kind of like serious events and finally, the coup attempt really intensified the sense of being alone and not being supported enough by the traditional allies of Turkey in the West. And the third perception that is now prominent within the state apparatus among these different actors is that the US hegemony is in decline. And that gives Turkey an opportunity to reposition itself as a regional hegemon. And the hard power is the right way to do so. So that's kind of like these three, I think, perceptions really are prominent within Ankara today, especially since 2016. But in addition to the changing actor configurations and perceptions, I think one important factor, domestic factor, that really mediated or kind of like built into the increasing militaristic foreign policy since 2016 has been the capabilities. And there I want to mention two factors. One is military capabilities that has been really growing since in the last decade, but against the background of actually starting from 1974 when Turkey invaded Cyprus and the US basically put a US arms embargo on Turkey. That was kind of like the first moment, I think, for the state elites in Turkey that Turkey needs an independent native defense industry. And since then, I think that awareness continued, and the last decade kind of like, I think almost like the final phase towards developing a native defense industry. But when I say capabilities, I think we also need to think about the negative version of capabilities. So in addition to military capabilities, I think diplomatic incapabilities also feed into the increasing militarization of foreign policy. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that the more Turkey feels that it's not supported by its traditional partners in the West, it kind of like isolates itself diplomatically and resorts to military power, and it turns into a vicious cycle. So in a way, I think Turkey has been increasingly since 2016 using symbolic insult in conducting its diplomacy. One last example of it, for instance, like with the decision to reconvert Hagia Sophia can be considered a symbolic insult. Or, for instance, when the Turkish foreign minister met with Josep Borrell a couple of months ago at the end of the live press conference, he basically gave him a gift in a kind of like a velvet box, and the gift was a hand sanitizer. So these kinds of like small symbolic insults to me are strong manifestations of Turkey's really growing inability to use diplomacy to solve its problems. So overall, actor configurations, perceptions, and capabilities, military capabilities together with diplomatic incapabilities, I think are important factors that led to increasing militaristic foreign policy.
Thank you for explaining to us how the domestic factors are playing into this as well. So you mentioned it's a confluence of various factors coming together that is really driving this. And here, I think I want to bring it to Alan and ask you sort of how unique this current assertive foreign policy that we're seeing in Turkey is to Turkish history and to Turkey's behavior. So you have worked on Turkey throughout Erdoğan's nearly 2 decades in power, but you also know Turkey's behavior before. So I would ask, how does this current assertive foreign policy differ from both in Erdoğan's early years in leadership, so 10, 15 years ago, but also how it differs from traditional Turkish foreign policy, which predates Erdoğan?
Great. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. It's first of all, it's a real honor to be on a panel with so many brilliant young scholars, and I'll include you in that, Merve. And also, I just did want to say I worked on the House Foreign Affairs Committee for many years covering the Middle East, as well as Turkey. And I started around the time POMED was founded, I believe, and I had the opportunity to work with POMED quite a bit. I think you guys have made a very important and unique contribution here in Washington. And so it's really, truly an honor for me to participate in one of your panels. Look,
honor to have us.
Astaghfirullah. Look, I think there really has been a dramatic change. If you take the long view in Turkey's recent behavior compared with its behavior throughout most of the history period of the Republic, which was founded in 1923. And for decades, Turkish foreign policy was really defensive, even passive, I think you could say, kind of typified by the Ataturk slogan, peace at home, peace abroad, kind of, you know, maybe a diplomatic version of we'll be nice if you'll be nice. And, you know, of course, there were some exceptions. Turkey sent troops to Korea. That was as part of a bid really to get into NATO. And of course, it unilaterally invaded Cyprus in 1974, which I think were exceptional circumstances. But for the most part, I think it's fair to say that throughout most of the history of the Republic, the Turkish military was far more focused on keeping order at home and on issues like extremism at home and Kurdish separatism than it was on adventurism abroad. The change was gradual. I think Sinem especially touched on a lot of the key dates, such as the US arms embargo from 1975 to 78, which convinced Turkey that they had to develop an indigenous arms production capacity. There was a gradual change in the 1980s. We saw Turkey doing hot pursuit into Iraq after the PKK. In the 1990s, we saw some large scale but time limited movements of large numbers of troops to fight the PKK, again in Iraqi Kurdistan, northern Iraq, as it's often referred to then. In the early years of the AKP and Erdoğan government, I think Erdoğan was primarily interested in having the West on his side out of fear of a military coup and changing Turkey's laws to civilianize Turkey as much as possible. He didn't want to alienate the West. And I think he had a softer foreign policy. The big change, I think to me, the first dramatic thing that happened was in 2015 when Turkey sends troops to Qatar and establishes a small base there. That was unprecedented for Turkey to send troops so far from its borders. And then we saw, of course, Euphrates Shield, Libya, which was very significant. And right now you have Turkish troops stationed in more than half a dozen countries. The 2016 coup attempt, there are some issues, and certainly Ilke covered it very well. I mean, there is some feeling that Erdoğan wanted to pursue a more aggressive policy before that, but that senior military leaders who were purged subsequent to the coup had restrained him. Following the coup, there was not that restraint. That's an opaque world. It's hard to know. But look, I think I'll just quickly mention three key factors that distinguish Turkey's aggressive foreign policy of today from its long time past and more recent years. I think the most obvious new element is a civilian government that wants to project an aura of recapturing the glory Turkish glory of the Ottoman Empire years, and also that sees itself as a natural leader for the Middle East and the Islamic world. And this notion, at least if polls are to be believed, has a surprisingly widespread appeal in Turkey, even beyond the supporters of the government. The second factor often overlooked, but not overlooked by Ilke, who explored it very well, is that Turkey is simply a wealthier, better militarily equipped nation than it was throughout most of its history. When I started working on Turkey in the 1980s at the State Department, I know before you guys were born, it was kind of on a par with Syria and Iraq and Iran, and also per capita income. And, the gap between Turkey and its immediate neighbors, like the ones I've just mentioned, as well as Greece, has really grown over the years. And that gives Turkey options it did not traditionally have. It has the opportunity to flex its muscles. It can throw its weight around, and now it often does. And of course, the third factor, which you touched on, Merve, in your introductory remarks, and I guess is really the overarching point of this panel, is governance and domestic politics, that Erdogan's authority is now essentially unassailable, including over the media, and it appears over the military. So as a result, criticism of his policies do not come through at the levels that at least public opinion polls suggest that it exists. Public opinion polls suggest the Turkish public as a whole is quite ambivalent about many of these military interventions. And, I would also just say, of course, Erdogan's aggressive proclivities, really reinforced by his coalition with, his effective coalition with the far-right nationalist MHP. Leave it at that.
Oh, thank you, Alan. I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned the public opinion polls as well, because that really brings us into this. I want to, in my next round, get a bit more focused and specific on this relationship between the growing authoritarianism inside and the aggression abroad, and this really gets to that even as much as the Turkish public might support the idea of Turkey playing a greater role in the region, it doesn't necessarily support the military interventions and the militaristic attitude that Turkey is displaying outside of its borders, which is more about the method, which I'm sure Ike can talk about too. But I thought one way of, since it is a difficult question, this relationship between the democratic demise at home and aggression abroad, I thought one aspect we could look at this, Ilke, with you, is Turkey's relationship with the EU, because in Erdogan's early years, when Turkey had showed that it was seriously interested in the accession process to the EU, it was also deliberately aligning domestically with European institutions, and I think very importantly with the European Convention on Human Rights. Today, about 17 years on, we are seeing that Turkey is defying a lot of these democratic norms and international human rights, and institutions that are pegged to the EU and are championed by the EU. And also, effectively speaking, its EU accession bid seems to be over. And so I wanted to ask you, what is the link between Turkey's democratic demise at home, so moving away from these institutions in alignment with these norms, these values, and the European Court of Human Rights, for example, and the end of the accession process, and more broadly, Turkey's aggression in all of its region?
I think this is a very good question, and this link is quite important to establish. I think Turkey's democratic demise has played a very important role in the worsening of the relations between Turkey and the European Union. But I think we should complete the picture with other developments in the European Union and in the world. I'm sorry for insisting over and over about this, because I think we tend to have Turkey-EU relations in a bubble and try to understand it inside that bubble. But I think there are so many other broader concepts and factors that we should take into account. Clearly, the challenges the rules-based international order, whatever it is, has been facing, had an important effect. The changes European Union had itself has an important effect, not being ready to more enlargement waves, being in crisis for the last 2 decades, starting with the constitutional crisis in the beginning of the century, then the economic crisis and the Eurozone crisis, then the political crisis that came with the irregular migration, and then Brexit, the election of President Trump, and then COVID. So if we look at the last 2 decades of the European Union, we are seeing that the EU was also going through a transformation of itself, and it has clearly affected the relationship with Turkey. And the third layer is clearly the Turkey's democratic backsliding and the institutional change there. The coup attempt in 2016 has been already explained very well by Sinem and Ellen, but I would like to elaborate a bit more on the transition to presidential system, because I think it has been very important when we look at from the European point of view, because it's not just clearly troubled the democratic credentials, like especially the checks and balance, the lack of checks and balances and the issues related to the system itself. And it was very much disputed by OSCE and Council of Europe. So these reports were used over and over again by EU officials to challenge that Turkey is not even fulfilling the Copenhagen criteria anymore. But also it has removed many of the institutions and institutional setups and interlocutors that the European officials have been using and relating to daily. If we want to connect this to the foreign policy making, actually I will underline the importance of Ministry of Foreign Affairs clearly, but we can talk about any other institutions, any other institution that has been affected with this transition to presidential system. I would like to add 2 more points if you let me so, and the first one is personalization of foreign policy. I think this is a concept that the Americans are very familiar with, but we should connect it very much to the democratic demise of Turkish Republic here. Because as the country became a presidential system and not necessarily care about the checks and balances and free media and basic rights and freedoms, any policy, but also foreign policy, became a very personalized as well. So I think this link should be established and should be understood very clearly. And the second one is the relationships that President Erdoğan has with, for example, President Trump, with President Putin, got into the center of its foreign policy, which is not necessarily the case when it comes to the European Union. Because the European Union is a very complex entity with lots of institutions and lots of member states. So it's not necessarily clearly Erdogan has a link with Merkel, has not a great link with Emmanuel Macron, etc., etc. But when it comes to the European Union, which is very much based on institutional framework, this is a tough link to establish when you are thinking about way more personalized foreign policy. And one last point, I think it is very important to understand Turkey's relations with the European Union when it comes to foreign policy, is that I think the EU is every day accepting more and more a transactional relationship with Turkey. Because when we look at the European Council conclusions from October, we see various issues related to Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey's aggressive foreign policy, unilateral actions, etc., etc. But we have seen no references to democratic backsliding or human rights or rule of law, etc., etc. This tendency was already there with the EU-Turkey statement on refugees from March 2016. But I think when we come to 2020, it became even more visible in Turkey's relationship with the European Union. So going back to your question, democratic demise is there, and it's affecting Turkey-EU relations in various dimensions. But if we want to see a more complete picture, we should also be aware of other dimensions and other important issues on the agenda that are affecting the world, the European Union, and Turkey-EU relations.
Thank you, Inika. And especially on your final point about the transactional approach, I do want to come back to that later, particularly with Alan about the US, when we were talking about the US response and how can Turkey's more democratic transatlantic allies help shape Turkey's behavior internally and abroad. But before that, I do want to come back to Sinem with this question of foreign policy making in Turkey, because now we have mentioned, both Ilke and Alan have mentioned the difficulty, the repressive environment, and how that makes it difficult to argue with the foreign policy set forth by President Erdoğan. And so I wanted to ask you, is there a popular demand within Turkey for a more restrained approach abroad? And that can be in any shape or form as you'd like to answer. But, you know, I guess what I'm really getting at is that in an increasingly authoritarian environment like Turkey, are people able to express any dissent towards the existing foreign policy and seriously debate alternative policies? And that, I mean, both the popular opposition and also political opposition.
Mm-hmm. And before I answer that, I just want to open a parenthesis and just make a remark about, I mean, it's true with the transition to presidential system, power is centralized in the hands of the president because he has the absolute control over institutions. But I also think that there is a simultaneous process going on which has to do with factionalization of power. And that means that although the president has absolute power over institutions, he actually doesn't have that absolute power in political sense because of what I said earlier, that he's mainly dependent on the ultranationalist MHP and different factions within the security apparatus who has a strong commitment to take Turkey's national sovereignty and territorial integrity. But also, I think there is a quite rapid formation of informal loyalty networks within the AKP itself, which to a certain extent shape decision-making processes, not only in domestic policy, but also in foreign policy. So, and now coming to your question, among the political opposition parties, I think there is a growing discontent because of the increasing the militarized foreign policy, and for two reasons. I think there is a growing criticism about Turkey's increasing isolation in the international arena. Mainly the main opposition parties, CHP and E party, definitely are not happy with that. And the second criticism has to do with Turkey's growingly, basically the damaged international reputation. You see those two criticisms often in the Turkish parliament, for instance, being voiced. Also, both the opposition parties, but also the presidents, some of the actors in the security apparatus who give support to the president are also critical of lack of diplomatic relations with Assad and Egypt, for instance. So there's a growing pressure on the president towards those ends as well. But having said this, when we again look at the opposition parties, it's interesting because when the Turkish parliament, the Turkish parliament legislated a bill to basically send military troops to Iraq and Syria in 2017. And that bill every year, because it's basically for a period of 1 year, and the bill is renewed every year. So it's basically put on to vote in the parliament. So when you look at, and the same is done for Libya as well, not for sending troops, but military engagement. So with the bills about Iraq and Syria, it gets support from CHP and E party. So the only party that doesn't support the bill is HDP. But when you look at the voting, when it comes to Libya, there actually it's only the AKP, MHP, and Büyük Birlik Partisi, another ultra-nationalist party, that gives support to the bill to basically have military engagement in Libya. But the opposition parties, CHP, E party, and so on, they are quite vocal about not supporting it. And Libya, in a way, this all makes sense because Iraq and Syria, I think, fall into the traditional concerns of the Turkish state apparatus. and CHP and E Party are kind of like also aligned with those traditional concerns. But Libya, in the history of the Turkish foreign policy, is, I think, a completely new front. So in that sense, it's kind of like it's a front that creates some discontent and disagreement among the opposition parties. Now, when you look at the societal level, the public support, actually it's extremely polarized. Like according to the September poll of the pollster Metropole, it's interesting, 46% of those who were surveyed agree that the hard power methods are suitable with solving Turkey's problems. And equally, 45.2% of those who were surveyed said that they don't agree with the statement. So this is like, this I think indicates a very clear polarization in the population. It's the same with in terms of the relationship between international isolation and the methods that Turkey uses. So 49% of those who were surveyed disagree that there is no relationship, that isolation, Turkey's international isolation, is not a consequence of its militarized foreign policy, whereby 42% said they agree with the statement. So it's almost like half-half. And that, I think, is also kind of demonstrates the complicated, complication and the complexity of the problem. Now, when you look at the public opinion about specific cases, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, for instance, 46% of the surveyed actually are in favor of diplomatic methods to solve the problem. So although overall, in terms of the overall foreign policy, the opinion is very polarized, when it comes to specific cases, I think it's fair to say that there is an inclination towards solving those specific problems through diplomatic methods. Now, the question about whether there is serious debate about alternative foreign policy, well, there is some debate, but unfortunately, it is very much confined, mainly because of the fact that the media landscape, you also wrote about this, Merve, is very much controlled by the ruling party. So it's basically, and like there are obviously alternative media outlets online and so on. But when you look at actually a study done by EDAM, a Turkish think tank, even on social media and within these alternative media outlets, the discussion is extremely polarized. So it takes place in echo chambers. So it's in a way kind of like, I think, is in line with also the polling results. Now, in terms of the dissent, it exists, of course, but it's heavily suppressed. For instance, during Turkey's operations in Afrin, there were like demonstrations in the country, but people were taken under custody. For instance, there was a demonstration at one of the universities in Istanbul, and 27 out of 30 students who basically demonstrated were tried under terrorism charges, and they were eventually charged with 10 months of imprisonment. Equally on social media, people who tweet in a critical way are also taken under custody, so on and so forth. And in the case of Libya, for instance, recently some journalists were taken under custody and also imprisoned for some of the remarks that they made and so on. So there is heavy repression. Before I conclude, I just want to make a point, and like a last point, about the relationship between war making and authoritarianism. I mean, we always obviously think about the relationship that authoritarianism, Turkey's democratic backsliding, autocratization, authoritarianism, whatever we want to call it, leads to Turkey's war-making efforts. But I think there as well, there is a kind of like a vicious cycle, because Turkey's war-making efforts also very much intensify its authoritarianism. And it's often discussed like whether Turkey is able to sustain its increasingly militaristic policy because of the economic woes. But I think the question that is not being asked is actually who benefits from all these war-making efforts. Clearly, the security elites benefit from it because it's ideologically benefit from it, but there is also a group of people who benefit from this economically. So it's defense industry being one, construction sector being another, and so on. So the war-making efforts, I think, also contribute to the support that are given by certain elites to President Erdoğan and the regime that he has been trying to build. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so you're saying that, even if these adventures are not necessarily good for Turkey's economy overall, it ends up benefiting the very few nodes that are keeping Erdogan's government afloat, or regime, as some might call it. I want to bring it to Ellen. I'm mindful of our time, and I do want to take there are some very good audience questions I'm already seeing. But before we fully move on, because Ilke sort of critiqued the transactionalist approach. I'm going to say you critiqued it, implicitly critiqued it, I think, that there's this transitional approach that the EU is showing Turkey, and sort of falsely separating the domestic developments from Turkey's foreign policy behavior. How would you say should the United States be responding to this? Because it is a conundrum that the US has been facing, just like all the EU leaders separately and together with all their differences, Ilke, as you keep mentioning. But what do you think, Alan, would an effective US policy would look like towards an increasingly authoritarian and increasingly assertive Turkey outside its borders?
Yeah. Well, look, it's a tough question, and there's no simple answer. But let me throw out a couple of ideas, and I'll try to do it briefly. Basically, I think we need three elements that we're lacking now, and the first two of which apply more generally to US foreign policy rather than only specifically to Turkey. I think the US has to make human rights once more a key element of its foreign policy. It's for the sake of our values regarding Turkey. It's for the sake of the many, many Turks who are committed to democracy. And I think we saw some demonstration of that in the Istanbul local election, when a significant number of people changed their vote. Rather than vote for the AKP candidate, they voted in significant numbers for the CHP candidate, Imamoglu, out of what seemed to be a sense of fair play. He had won what appeared to be a very narrow but very clear majority. And on the second round, when he was forced into a redo, he won in a landslide. So I think it said something about the degree to which there's still a democratic culture in Turkey. And frankly, it's also important for the US to focus on human rights as an element in our diplomatic toolbox. I would point out that NATO, by its charter, is supposed to be an alliance of democracies. So it's really appalling that the US remains largely silent in the face of so many egregious human rights abuses in Turkey. And, I won't detail them. I think everyone here knows the story. And look, we have to be realistic. I'm not saying we should never work with a Turkey that's less than democratic. That's not realistic. But we do have to call out a NATO member in the face of clear abuse and focus on efforts to modify efforts in modifying that behavior. Second, the US has to show leadership on regional issues. One of the reasons, as has been said here, that Turkey has had space to pursue an aggressive foreign policy is because of the vacuum left by the US withdrawal from regional leadership. It's one of the reasons you end up with a mess like you have in Libya, where we really have many US allies and partners siding with Russia on one side. And of course, we have Turkey, which is also an ally, siding with the internationally recognized government on the other side. I think some of this could be preempted if the US were simply more involved. Obviously, the US can't manage every single problem, but it ought to be able to judge those which potentially could create crises and preempt them through appropriate management. By the way, I think hands-on involvement in the Greek-Turkish tensions could have allowed us to take some steps that would have precluded some of Turkey's more provocative actions, and the downward spiral that I think is still happening now. Nothing is certain, but the US has to at least show up and be a leader. Again, I'm not saying that it's a surefire guarantee to prevent problems, but I think it's an important shock absorber. Then lastly, and this is Turkey specific, the US has to reestablish leverage in its relations with Turkey. I know it's easier said than done. I would have to say, for me, as somebody who has followed Turkey, I was a student in Turkey in the late 70s, and after that worked in government and think tank world on Turkey and US-Turkish relations. The biggest change I have seen over that period is the switch in the sense of leverage in the bilateral relationship, certainly on the part of Turkey. Turks, which used to feel dependent on the United States, have really come to see themselves as holding the leverage in the relationship. And this is something actually that's been reflected publicly too in polls as well. I see everyone on this panel likes reading polls. And it's a big change. Now, how do you change it? Look, of course, it's tricky. We want to reel Turkey back into the tent. We don't want to, take actions that push it away. But I think, for example, when the president did not even indicate interest in implementing CAATSA, the Countering America's Adversaries Abroad Through Sanctions Act, a very long, unwieldy name, which we referred to by its initials as CAATSA, which called for sanctions against countries that do a significant defense transaction with Russia. Look, there were loopholes in this. I'm not saying Trump acted illegally in ignoring it. It could have been written in a more airtight way, but the fact is he did ignore it. And I'm not even saying he had to implement it immediately, but he should have at least spoken out on it and said, Turkey, okay, if you don't mothball the S-400, there is sanctions coming. We know sanctions work. Trump did actually use sanctions in the Pastor Brunson affair. Turkey is economically vulnerable. And, I don't want to punish Turkey, but I think often the mere threat can have an impact. Look, this is a longer discussion. I'll try to cut it. Just to sum up, human rights, US leadership, and leverage. I think those are the principles. There's many specific issues that are troublesome, that have no clear-cut solution, in my view, like the YPG issue, Erdogan's suspicions that the US was behind the 2016 coup attempt, Turkey's collaboration with Hamas. These are all specific problems, difficult to solve, but I think they could be managed more easily within this kind of rough framework that I've outlined.
Answer, and I want to really quickly ask Ilke and Sinem if you would like to weigh in from the EU's perspective or from the European perspective, since you're both based there and are looking at that side of the transatlantic aisle. What are things that can be that Turkey's European neighbors could do that are better and more effective in getting some sort of behavioral change from Turkey, from Erdogan's Turkey?
Should I, Sinem? You
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, it is important to underline that we are talking about the same thing when it comes to Turkey-EU relations. The leverage structure has been reshuffled and the table is upside down. So this means that Turkey has been challenging both the European Union and the US at the same time. Recently, a bit, let's do some self-advertisement here, but recently we have published a common policy paper for SWP suggesting that the modernization of the customs union, if it's used right, could be a tool for the EU to go back to the track, because the core question here is, I'm sure Sinan will elaborate further on that, but the core question is, there is a huge interdependency with Turkey and the European Union. This is larger in some cases, smaller in other cases, but Turkey and the European Union have to relate. And better that if this relationship is based on rules and principles. But at the same time, the recent tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean showed us that the European Union does not have the luxury to be in this fragile status quo. So the challenging question is how to combine this, how to create a coexisting mechanism for rules-based order, for principled approach from the European Union, with a realistic approach when it comes to accession negotiations. So there are colleagues that are defending that the accession negotiations should be taken away from the table and modernized customs union together with some kind of visa liberalization regime, further collaboration on migration, and further collaboration on fight against terrorism should be put on table. Some others say the accession negotiations should stay there for the longer term, and you never know what will happen. But in the meantime, Turkey and the European Union should find a couple of grounds, couple of points, as I have been mentioning some of them, to relate in the meantime. But what is very clear for me, what is one takeaway message for me, is Turkey and the European Union do not have the luxury for not relating and being on this fragile status quo, which is not necessarily served to anyone's interests.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add, maybe about the human rights dimension, of which is a leverage point, I guess, that the EU can still use towards Turkey?
Just very quickly, I think as far as I follow, there are two schools of thought in Europe in terms of how to engage. I mean, basically, one school of thought argues that Turkey needs to be contained. The other school of thought argues that Turkey needs to be engaged, mainly because in certain areas, mainly migration, counterterrorism, and defense, Turkey remains an important cooperation partner. So that's too important to kind of like put to the side. So Europe needs to engage with Turkey. I actually think there is a third way which combines both. So there needs to be a policy to contain, and that I think is linked to what you just said in terms of human rights, because the way I see it is impunity is part of the problem, because the more, like basically the Turkey is daring and almost like the reckless attitude is partially a result of not being punished, because it's almost like pushing the boundaries and you see that nothing is happening, you push the boundaries more. So therefore it somehow needs to be punished. But at the same time, I mean, it is also really an important, I think, partner for Europe, so that there needs to be some form of engagement within the context of a rule-based framework. And within that context, I think one very important thing is what goes back to what I said earlier in answering to the first question, this Turkey is increasing diplomatic inability. So in a way, I think in the short term, it is a really, I think, urgent need to almost like re-socialize Turkey into the diplomatic circles in order to create this rules-based framework to move on in relations. So, I mean, but that's again, like how that could be done. It's a very difficult question. That's what kind of this was the, I think, the kind of like the analytical spine of the customs union paper that Ilke just mentioned, that we kind of argue that customs union can be used as a leverage to kind of pull Turkey into a rule-based framework, because in order to start the negotiations on the modernization of the customs union, Turkey actually needs to implement a couple of reforms, mainly in the judiciary and the economic realm. So that's, I mean, that might have certain spillover effect. It doesn't have to, it might have, but we think that it's a good start to move forward with.
Speaking of this, there's a really good question from our audience that I want to bring into this rules. When we talk about the rules-based order, it's a slightly different, but it also brings me to Alan's point about prioritizing human rights concerns in devising our foreign policy. This question is, I think, a very interesting one, because it says, can some of Turkey's interventions, which are actually isolating it in its region, be, quote, good for democracy, such as when it supports Libya's UN-recognized government against General Haftar, or autocracies like Egypt, or, Turkey has been a big critic of Saudi Arabia, not because of Yemen, but because of the murder of Khashoggi, which are moral cases that Erdogan is making. And I think this is where the question is coming from. I wanted to ask you all about that. Are these things that Turkey is doing ideologically driven, and are they contributing to democracy anywhere within or outside of Turkey? Sinem, can we start? Yeah.
I mean, it's a very good question. And I think that question, you can kind of like extend that question to what Ellen was saying earlier about Turkey trying to position itself as the leader of the Muslim world and Erdogan being the patron of the Muslim masses. Because in doing that, to do that, actually Turkey uses the rhetoric of combating Islamophobia very effectively all around. And now there is obviously a fact, like Islamophobia is a fact that needs to be combated. So there is a truth in basically what Turkey is saying and what Turkey is doing. But the problem is, I think, and that kind of like you can apply that to like the Turkey's position to a certain extent in the Arab Spring and so on. But the problem, I think, is in the, I'm going to use the word hypocrisy, in the hypocrisy of the position, because you can't really claim to be fighting for justice all around and implement all sorts of injustices back at home. Then you need to basically account for that hypocrisy. Or, for instance, again, going back to this, trying to basically position itself as the leader of the Muslim world, you can't also selectively implement that, i.e., be very vocal about Islamophobia in Europe and in the US, but be quiet about what China is doing to Uyghurs, mainly because you don't want to basically kind of hurt your relations with China. So I think the problem there is not even about whether those actions and words and deeds are contributing to democracy. The essence of the problem is the hypocrisy of the policies.
Mm-hmm. Alan, did you have a comment on that? I just saw.
Oh, well, no, I'll just say quickly, some of Turkey's interventions might have positive results. For example, in Libya, I think there is some evidence that stopping Haftar really prevented a serious bloodbath in Tripoli. And possibly, although I don't necessarily see it contributing to the rise of democracy in Libya, perhaps through some indirect way it will, but promoting democracy is not what the intention is here. Turkey has other both hard interests and, say, glory promotion objectives, not democracy.
Can I come in shortly on this as well?
Mm-hmm, sure. I mean, I was going to say, because I think the majority of the questions are, and this is a good way to wrap up our panel because we do have 1 minute, of how ideologically driven do you think is Turkey's current aggression abroad is really, I think, comes to the heart of the question.
I still want to go one step back and comment on the previous question, because I think it's a very good and important point, and I have actually 2 comments on that. The first one is, whatever the intentions are and whatever the drivers of the intentions are, the methods Turkey is using is not necessarily the way to go, according to my point of view. Like, the intentions and the debates should be on the table. This is clear that there's a need for a settlement, for example, in Cyprus. This has been a very long-term dispute. There's a need for settlement when it comes to exclusive economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean. There should be more dialogue on that. These are clear. And these questions should be put back on the table, on the attention of further actors. But how you do so is leaving Turkey very much alone and very disputed in the international arena. And I don't see this as a positive thing, according to my point of view. This is clearly depends on where you are looking from. The second point I wanted to make is that the rules-based world order, whatever that is, has been established after the Second World War, during Cold War and post-Cold War period. It is clear that the world in 21st century is not necessarily fit into that model. That model requires to be revised. But the intentions of all these actors, be it Turkey, China, Russia, no, they are called revisionist actors, whatever that is, that means, it is somehow opening the Pandora's box and opening the debate for discussion, and which may end up in a 21st century rules-based order. But it shouldn't end up in a non-rules-based order. For me, if Turkey wants to serve this, if Turkey wants to discuss all of these, it should open all these questions to debate in a more diplomatic way and based on dialogue and negotiations. I think I will stop there. I'm sure Sinan will further comment on the ideological side, and she has great work on that.
Well, we actually thank you for that. I think it's a great note to end on. We do have to wrap it up now. We are out of time, unfortunately. I want to thank all of you. Ilke, I do think that was a very good note to end this on, the importance of dialogue and going back to diplomacy. I just want to thank all our panelists for making the time today, and to our audience for tuning in and for all your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Are we done recording?